Boldwood presents Nellie's Heartbreak, written by Rosie Clarke and read by Emma Swan. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Nellie Peace, I'm warning you. If you don't get yourself up here fast, girl, I'll make you sorry you were born. I could hear my mother's voice calling to me from the backyard of our terraced cottage. She sounded frustrated and angry, and I knew I was in trouble. Standing in Grandad Barnes' allotment, which was tucked behind a sheltering wall and out of sight, I was, for the moment, safe from her wrath and continued to eat the large, fat gooseberries, relishing their tart but delicious flavour as the juice spilled over and dribbled down my chin. My grandad had seen me there earlier and winked at me as he indicated the ripe fruit. I knew he wouldn't scold, however much I ate. The warmth of the early summer sun made me reluctant to answer her call, even though failure to do so would bring swift retribution. Mother's name was Rose Peace, and she was a sharp-tongued woman in her early 30s. Tall, thin and attractive in her way, she nevertheless had a hard, unforgiving manner, seldom smiling unless it was at my younger brother Bob, who was still only 8 and the darling of her heart. For me, there was never a smile, nor yet a word of praise. I might have been swifter to answer her summons if there had been. I ought to have gone up to the house when she called me, of course, but she had been at me all morning, sniping and carping, and I'd sneaked away when her back was turned. Even as I struggled with my conscience, I saw Grandad open the wooden gate that connected the allotment to our tiny yard, and was spiked with guilt as I saw the way he was hobbling. His rheumatism had been playing him up for days. It showed in his face as he shuffled painfully towards me, his scuffed boots dragging over the rough paving stones. Wilf Barnes had worked down the coal mines for most of his life, but every spare moment he'd had once his shift down the pit was finished had been spent here in his allotment. My beloved Grandad was famed for his vegetables and soft fruits, never failing to carry off half the prizes at the annual village shows. He had hoped to spend all his days working his small plot when he retired, but the miseries had caught up with him too soon, and now he could hardly walk. My father had taken over from him, but everyone said that Sam Peace did not have Grandad's green fingers. It was true, but neither Grandad nor I would have dreamed of repeating such talk within Dar's hearing. We two kept our secrets to ourselves. "Hello, Grandad," I called to him. "What are you doing down here, then?" As if I didn't know, he had come to look for me, of course. He was a quiet man, saying very little when my mother's temper got the better of her, but whenever he could, he tried to shield me from the worst of it. He never said nor did anything to indicate that he cared for me more than my brother, but sometimes there was a special warmth in his eyes as he looked at me, and we had this understanding between us, a feeling that needed no words. When I was younger, he had often carried me around the village on his shoulders, and I loved the warm, peppery smell of him. "Didn't you hear your mother calling?" he asked, a faint reproach in his voice. "She's on the warpath now, lass. You'd best get yourself up there and do what she wants." "Yes, Grandad." There was no escaping now, not after he had hauled himself from his chair and made what must have been a tiring journey in search of me. "I'm sorry," I said, and darted at him, kissing his cheek with lips still moist and sticky from the gooseberries. "I'll go straight up, and thank you." He leaned on his stick, his eyes following my progress as I ran towards the yard. He would rest for a while before himself returning, dreaming in the sun of the days when he was a young man and courting my grandmother. He had told me so many stories of her that I felt I knew Dolly Barnes, even though she had died before I was born. She had been a kind, good woman who came from Malham, some 10 miles distant from our village, and sometimes I wept because I had never felt the warmth of her arms about me. I knew why my mother had been calling me. I hadn't responded because if there was one chore I hated, it was helping with the washing. I hated wash day altogether. Hated the smell of the soda and the steam coming out of the dirty clothes as they boiled in the old-fashioned copper in the scullery. It stung my eyes and throat, making my head ache if I was in there too long. Mother said it was only an excuse to get out of helping, but that wasn't true. I didn't mind work. I rather liked peeling potatoes and cleaning the vegetables Father brought in from the allotment. I would quite happily peg the clothes on the line or wash the dishes. Making beds and beating rugs weren't high on my list because the dust got up my nose and made me sneeze, but I didn't complain when I was asked to do these things. It was the washing I hated, and my mother knew that. Today was Monday the 6th of May 1935, and a special school holiday had been granted. In London, King George and Queen Mary were celebrating their Silver Jubilee, and there were to be street parties all over the country. But for me, there was to be no escape and no idleness. I was a girl, and girls were expected to help in the house. Sometimes I envied Bob his freedom. Occasionally, he helped with the allotment, but most of the time he was allowed to run free in the village streets with his friends, getting into all kinds of scrapes. My mother turned a blind eye to his wildness, except for the time he'd come home with a bruised face from fighting with the tinkers on the common, and then she had made my father take his belt to him. "I won't have you mixing with that trash," she had said, her face grim as he'd screamed and wept for the pain. "Let this be a lesson to you." Afterwards, he had been sent to bed without any supper, but she had relented and taken him up a slice of his favourite cake later. Now and then, I wondered why she liked Bob so much more than she liked me. When I reached the wash house, Mother had rinsed the sheets and was wringing them out by hand. She looked up as I entered, but didn't say anything, simply thrusting one end of a sheet at me. I took it, and in silence we folded and refolded the wet linen. Then I pressed the ends close to the great wooden rollers of the heavy mangle and began to wind the handle. It was hard work, and I had to use 2 hands before the water started to drip into the tin bath beneath, splashing at first, then reducing to a trickle as the sheet was put through for a second time. There were 3 singles as well as a double. Mother put top to bottom each week and washed the bottom sheet, and 5 pillowcases as well as the bolster covers, several towels, vests, long johns, shirts and Grandad's combinations, all of which had been boiled until they were white. "That's the lot then," she sighed with satisfaction. "Help me carry the basket out to the yard." The rush basket was heavy with so many damp clothes and sheets packed into it, but I was tall and strong for my 14 years. I would be 15 on my next birthday, and people often thought I was older. Once outside in the sunshine, I could breathe more easily. I bent down to take my end of the sheet as we pegged it on one of the lines that ran the full length of the yard. Soon the rows of spotless washing were flapping lazily in the breeze. Mother's expression was a mixture of triumph and tiredness. It was always a battle on wash day with 3 men in the house, and, for a moment, I felt sorry that I had deserted her. "Are you going to the party this afternoon, Ma?" I asked. "Everyone will be there." "Then they won't miss me, will they?" she replied sourly. "I haven't got time for gallivanting, though I suppose you'll have to go or there will be sulks." "They gave us a school holiday so that we could." My cheeks were burning as I looked at her. It wasn't fair of her to be so harsh. I helped her most evenings when I came home from school, and I'd cleaned the bedrooms before escaping to the allotment that morning. "You'll be leaving school soon," she said, a speculative expression in her eyes. 15 next month, Nellie. You're nearly a grown woman." "Yes, Ma." Her eyes were greenish in colour, very like my own. We were alike in some ways, both tall and stubborn, though I was much heavier than her, and she made me very aware of my size. "I'll be able to help you more then, won't I?" I spoke apologetically, wanting to take that tired, strained look from her face. She seemed to have so little joy in life, and I sometimes wondered what had made her the way she was. It wasn't that she had an especially hard life. for my father was a gentle man and good to her. In the scullery, the whitewash was peeling off the walls because of the damp, but the rest of the house was comfortable enough. We weren't rich, but we certainly weren't poor, and most women in our village would have been grateful for what they had, but there was always a downturn to her mouth and a bitterness that spilled out when she was weary or angry. "That's as may be," she said now, her eyes flicking away. She scooped up the empty basket, tucking it under her arm. "You can go to the baker's for me and take a message to your dad at the same time." I nodded, saying nothing as I followed her inside. That kind of chore was much more to my liking. Most days Mother made her own bread, but not on wash day. For just that one day she grudgingly bought from the small bakery at the bottom of the hill. Mr. Robinson delivered to all his regular customers free of charge, but we did not belong to those privileged few. Mother would have thought it wasteful to buy when she could make. She took some coins from her purse in the dresser and pressed them into my hand. "A large white, and make sure you don't lose the change." "Of course not." I felt resentful as I pocketed the money. Did she think I was so foolish that I could not be trusted to do a simple errand? "What shall I say to Dad?" "Tell him not to forget his promise," she said, and once again her eyes slid away from mine. "He'll know what I mean." I wondered what all the mystery was about. She usually said what she meant straight out, and I sensed something hidden, almost furtive in her manner. Once I was out of the house, though, I soon forgot the small mystery. Walking down the road, my spirits began to lift, and I hummed a tune from the music halls. Grandad had taught me several, and they made me laugh inside. "I'm Burlington Bertie, I rise at 10:30 and saunter along." I too sauntered along, as if I had all the time in the world. The village was grouped into two huddles of terraced grey houses by the steep hill that divided Lower Stonkton from Upper Stonkton. Set in the shelter of the impressive Pennines, the houses were mostly built of tough abrasive stone with slate roofs and small, perpetually closed windows through which the cold winds penetrated in winter, but the sun seemed never to shine, making the rooms dark and cheerless, even now in early summer. The sun was warm out of the wind. Birds sang in back gardens that had just begun to burst with colour after the long winter, and all was right with the world as I hummed my songs and thought about the likelihood of my father giving me a penny or two to spend at the shop. He did now and then when my mother wasn't around to remind him that sweets were a waste of money and ruined your appetite for proper food. I thought about something she had said at breakfast that morning. It was what had upset me, the real reason I had taken refuge in the allotment. "You're a great lump of a thing," she had grumbled as I spread strawberry jam on my toast. "Is that the third round or the fourth you've had?" It was only my second, and I had left it uneaten on the plate. "It's puppy fat," Grandad had defended me. "She'll grow out of it. Besides, there's many a man prefers an armful in bed on a cold night to a bag of bones. Our Nellie won't go short of offers when she's older. You take my word for it." "You just wash your mouth out with carbolic." Mother's reply was predictable. "Giving the girl ideas. Whatever next?" I knew what they were both referring to. You couldn't live in a small village like ours and not know the facts of life. Mother was a good neighbour. She helped out with births, sicknesses and deaths, and I often had to run errands, boil water and be prepared to fetch the doctor or the undertaker, whichever proved necessary. So I had a good idea of what went on when babies were born, even if I wasn't quite so sure of how they got started. But I didn't see why Grandad's remarks should give me ideas. Like most girls of my age, I dreamed vaguely of marriage and a home of my own one day, but took little notice of the opposite sex except for my family, which may be why I didn't notice the young man until he planted himself firmly in the middle of the path, preventing me from walking on. "Where are you off to then, young Nell?" I looked at him consideringly, a little annoyed at the cheeky note in his voice. Just who did he think he was, talking to me like that? "You're back then," I said flatly. "I thought your family had gone for good." Tom Herries was one of the Tinker family. It was fighting with one of his younger brothers that had got Bob into such hot water with Mother.
"Hoped you'd see the last of me, eh?" he grinned. "Can't stop a bad penny turning up, that's what they say, ain't it?"
I suppose he was a bad penny. My mother would certainly say so. She had no time for the Herries family, and nor had most of the local people. Tom's father was a surly-looking man who had come and gone over the years, living quietly in his horse-drawn caravan. He'd mended pots and pans, undertaken odd jobs, and then wandered off again with his pasty-faced wife and brood of noisy, dirty children. But the previous winter there had been trouble. One of Tom's elder brothers had become involved with a local girl, a girl who had hitherto been highly respectable. Her father had warned the tinker off, but he wouldn't be told, and they'd fought. The older man ending up with a broken head and the girl running off with her lover, her father's curses ringing in her ears. The incident had turned folk against the tinkers, and several of the men got together to warn the Herries family that they were no longer welcome. "You weren't the cause of the trouble," I said after some deliberation. I hadn't thought about it before, but in the past I'd found Tom good company. We had gone fishing for frogs and newts in the pond some years back, and he'd once beaten off some bullies who were pulling my hair as I walked home from school. I supposed I quite liked him. The quarrel wasn't your fault, was it? Tom's dark eyes sparkled with humour as he gazed down at me from his superior height. He was taller than most lads his age, which was a little over 18, broad-shouldered and handsome despite the way his black hair straggled from under a filthy cap, and his threadbare trousers were tied around his waist with string, his black boots worn down at the heels and cracked beneath their layers of mud.
"Your ma wouldn't agree with that," he remarked cheerfully.
"No, I don't suppose she would. But Ma doesn't agree with much, I say." That made him laugh out loud. He had very bold eyes, and they roved over me, bringing a flush to my cheeks and making me uneasy.
"You're all right, young Nell," he said, a quirk to his mouth. "When I'm rich, I might come back and marry you."
"Who says I'd have you?" Tom chuckled deep in his throat. At that moment, something in his eyes made me want to slap him, but I was afraid that he might hit me back. I had heard somewhere that the Herries were a violent lot, though I had never seen any evidence of it in Tom. Still, it wasn't worth taking the risk.
"You'd have me all right. That's if I asked."
"You'll never be rich." His self-confidence was irritating. Anyone would think he was the son of a lord rather than a tinker's lad.
"Now that's what you think."
His mouth curved in a cocky smile.
"Tinker's blood might flow in my veins, but I've got what it takes up here."
He tapped one finger against the side of his head.
"I'm not going to live the way my folks do. I've got brains, and I'm going to use them to make a better life for myself."
"How?" I fixed him with a straight look. "Not by thieving, I hope."
"There's more than one way to skin a cat, and more than one way to get rich."
"Not for the likes of you, Tom Herries. You'll end up in prison or at the end of a rope. That's what you'll do."
"Then I'll be in good company."
His eyes mocked me.
"There's been many a gent caught with his fingers in the pie, but I shan't get caught."
"Says you. Rogues always pay for their sins in the end."
"You're still wet behind the ears if you believe that. You can get away with anything if you go about it in the right way."
His cheeky grin was back.
"You remember me, Nellie Peace. One day you'll know I was right."
I stared after him as he strolled off. "I'll never marry you, Tom Herries." He glanced back over his shoulder, an infuriating gleam in his eyes, but didn't say anything. I threw him a look of disgust. He was like the rest of his family after all, thieves and rogues. That was what Mother said, and for once I was inclined to agree. I had thought Tom might be different, but there was no way for a man like that to get rich. Not honestly. My father was the local shoemaker. He had his own small shop, and he earned decent money, enough to keep us all in clothes and food, and to put a bit by. But he wasn't rich, not like the gentry, not in the way Tom had meant. When the rest of the country was celebrating the royal occasion, Dar had gone to his shop and worked just the same. The baker was the only other man in the village to work that day, and like Dar, he preferred to make money to sitting at home twiddling his thumbs. My only experience of the gentry was the Harrington family. They lived in a big, ugly slate-grey house near Malham. I knew that because Father had taken me to the sheep sales in Malham a couple of times. These sales had been held there for nearly 200 years, and they attracted ordinary folk as well as the farmers who came to buy and sell stock. Once, Father had called at the Harringtons' house on the way to the sale to deliver some shoes he had made for a member of the family. I'd sat outside in the van he had borrowed for the day and waited for him, knowing he was pleased because they had asked him to make the shoes.
"It was a pleasure to make something from the very finest leather," he had told me afterwards. "And they're a good family, an old local family."
Sometimes, when my father had the use of a van, which belonged to another of his regular customers and could only be borrowed occasionally, he took me for a ride with him, showing me things I would otherwise never have seen. All around Malham was an area of extreme natural beauty, with the Pennine Way and eastward Gordale Scar, where waterfalls plunged down a ravine so deep that it had made me dizzy just to look at it. Then, high on the fells, there was Malham Tarn, its waters cold and mysterious, sometimes even threatening, which might be why the author Charles Kingsley had been inspired to write The Water Babies, one of my favourite stories at school, while staying at Malham Tarn House. For some reason, I was thinking of that day at the sales as I completed the last few yards to my father's shop at the end of the street, and wondered if he had made any more shoes for the Harrington family. If he had, I hadn't heard him mention it. As I entered the shop, with its clutter of tools, boots and shoes in various stages of repair, I inhaled the strong but pleasing odour of fresh-cut leather and smiled at my father sitting behind the workbench, feeling the familiar warmth inside as he greeted me with his serious gaze.
"Well then, Nellie,"
he said, glancing at me over the top of the gold-rimmed spectacles he wore for his work.
"Why aren't you at school? Not playing truant, I hope?"
"It's a holiday. Surely you haven't forgotten? For the Jubilee?"
"Ah, yes." He removed the glasses and rubbed his nose. "I mustn't forget the party this afternoon. I'll see if I can get along. So, what have you been doing with yourself then?"
"I've been helping Ma with the washing. Now I've come with a message. She said to tell you not to forget your promise, whatever that means." I was hopeful that he might enlighten me, but his expression closed up, and it seemed as if the message had touched a sore spot, reminding him of something he would rather have forgotten.
"As if I'm likely to forget after she went on about it the way she did," he muttered to himself. "She would never let me hear the last of it."
His gentle brown eyes dwelled on my face, and his expression puzzled me. It was as if he were regretting something, as if his thoughts were causing him distress.
"Here you are, lass."
His hand went to his rusty black waistcoat.
"Take this and buy yourself a treat."
"Thanks, Dar." I held out my hand, exclaiming as I saw what he had given me. "It's a shilling."
"Aye, I know."
He shifted uncomfortably on his stool.
"You're a good lass, you deserve it. But don't tell your mother."
"No fear of that," I said. She might have taken it away from me. "Thanks, Dar. Is there anything I can do for you? An errand?"
"No."
His eyes seemed glued to the bench in front of him.
"Get off and enjoy yourself while you can."
"I'll be away then." I was filled with a warm glow of gratitude as I left the shop. My Dar was that good to me. I loved both my father and Grandad so much that sometimes it hurt. I wanted to love my mother that way, but she was too sharp-tongued, too ready to slap first and ask after. Bob was a little pest at times, but he was my brother, and I felt protective towards him, as long as he wasn't telling tales to Mother. I wouldn't spend the whole shilling on sweets, I decided, though Bob would get a penny's worth of licorice bootlaces. Most of it would go on a few woodbines or some baccy for Grandad, if Mr. Brown at the corner shop would let me buy them. He often refused requests for single cigarettes from young lads of around my age, but he usually let me have them because he knew they were for Grandad. I was happy as I walked into the dim interior of the tiny corner shop, with its curious mixture of smells, soaps and paraffin warring with spices, fresh-cut flowers, fruit, vegetables and strong cheeses, pleased that I could take home a surprise for my grandfather. The village women had been busy baking and preparing from early that morning, most of them putting the Jubilee celebrations before their usual routine of washing and ironing. Gay strings of flags were fluttering from the lampposts. Long tables crowded with food, bottles of beer and lemonade had been set up by the green, and children were already playing ball games when I arrived with the plate of fairy cakes Mother had grudgingly sent after I got home from my errands. "You're to watch out for your brother," she told me before we left. "Don't let him fall in the pond, and don't let him mix with that tinker trash." I wondered how she knew that the Herries family had come back. As far as I knew, she hadn't been out of the house or yard all day, but perhaps she had had a visitor while I was on my errands. News travelled fast in a small village like ours. "Why don't you come with us, Ma?" I asked. "Couldn't the ironing wait for another day? Why don't you relax and have some fun for once?" "It's easy for you to talk," she replied. "Get off with you, Nellie. Sitting out in a breeze, listening to a lot of noisy brats screaming their heads off when they're not stuffing their faces or being sick isn't my idea of having fun." What was her idea of fun? It was difficult to imagine her ever having been young. Had she and my father ever gone to dances or to the pictures? Unless he fell asleep by the fire, my father spent his evenings reading the newspaper or listening to the wireless. Mother sometimes sat down to listen with him, but always with a bit of mending or knitting in her hands. I couldn't remember seeing her completely idle. She had always to be doing something. "Now remember what Ma said," I warned Bob as he ran off to join some of his friends. "You're to stay away from the tinkers." "Oh, Nellie," he grumbled. "Give over, do. You're worse than Ma." I shook my head but didn't try to argue with him. What harm could he come to when we were surrounded by people we knew? If he fell in the pond, a dozen hands would be there to pull him out. Seeing some of my own friends, I went to join them. "Sit here, Nellie," Mary Hopkin called and gestured to a chair beside her. "I've been saving this for you." Mary was a slight, fragile-looking girl with fair hair and pale blue eyes. She was sometimes bullied by other children at school, and I had tended to protect her, clipping the ear of cheeky lads who'd tugged at her plaits. Because of that, we had become very close, telling each other all our secrets. Mary's father was a farmer, not rich, but comfortable. He had a small car and had taken us both to the picture house in town for her birthday. We had seen a new musical with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. Mary was an only child, and her parents made a great fuss of her. She complained that they were overprotective, but I couldn't help thinking how lucky she was as she showed me the new dress her mother had made specially for the party. "It's really pretty," I said. "Have a fairy cake. Mother made them." "You try one of these cream horns," Mary countered. "Mother bought them from a shop in town. They're fresh cream. I've been saving these two for us in case you came." "Oh, lovely," I enthused as I took one of the cakes and bit into the crisp pastry and the cream with its oozing centre of raspberry jam. "I suppose it's fattening, but it does taste good." People were chattering all around us, and at the far side of the green the local brass band had begun to play a marching song. They made a couple of false starts, but then they were away, drums and trumpets competing in an attempt to see who could make the most noise. I thought it was a shame my mother hadn't come. All the other women seemed to be having a good time, and she was at home, ironing. The men had gathered together at the beer table, and the sound of their laughter grew louder and louder as the contents of bottles and barrels of ale were gradually emptied into glasses and tipped down their throats. I saw my father arrive and waved to him. He waved back, but just as he was about to come over to me, one of the other men pushed a glass of beer into his hand. I glanced away as Mary spoke to me, and when I looked back, I saw that Dar was laughing with the others at some joke or other. He seldom laughed like that, and it surprised me to see him accept another beer, drinking half of it down in one go as if he relished it. The brass band had retired for some refreshment, and someone had begun to play an accordion. The music was lighter, catchy, and feet started tapping all around me. Then a few of the women got up and began to dance together. One or two of the younger men joined them, and then 10 or 12 couples were dancing a kind of Irish jig that made everyone else clap and encourage them. "Dance with me, Nellie," Mary begged, pulling at my sleeve with eager hands. "Go on, it's fun." We got up and joined the others,
throwing ourselves into the dance with more enthusiasm than skill. We were both giggling when we found ourselves being parted by two young men. Mary's partner was a lad from the village, but the hand that grabbed mine belonged to Tom Herries. With my mother's warning still fresh in my mind, I tried to pull away from him, but he whirled me around so fast that I could scarcely catch my breath. He let me go only when the music had finished and I was panting. "You might have asked me," I muttered resentfully, "instead of taking it for—" My words were lost as we heard the angry shouting behind us and turned to look at the fight that had started. "Isn't that—" "That's my father. Damn him," Tom muttered. "I might have known he would ruin everything. It's the drink. He can't hold his drink." Tinker Herries was blind, roaring drunk. I supposed he must have had a first name, but if he did, I had never heard it. He was Tinker Herries to everyone, and he was generally spoken of with scorn or derision, especially since the incident the previous winter. Now, for the first time, I understood why my mother was so against the family. Clothed in filthy rags, unwashed and unshaven, Tinker stood in the middle of a group of men who were eyeing him warily, his fists clenched and held before him in an attitude of defiance. "Who among you weak-ass donkeys is man enough to take me on?" he roared while swaying on his feet. "Sure the lot of you are cowards, white-livered rats." Tom had left my side and was making his way through the stunned crowd towards his father. "Stop making a fool of yourself, Tinker," he said. "No one wants to fight you, it's a party." "And who asked you to poke your nose in, runt?" Tinker turned on his son in a blaze of fury. "Get out of my way before I thrash you." "Now then, Tink," Tom said, laying his hand persuasively on his father's arm. "Come away home." Tinker's answer was to lash out at him with his huge hands. The blow took Tom off guard and felled him. He lay on the ground, blood seeping from his nose as he shook his head. Before he could get up, Tinker kicked him in the side and he gave a scream of pain. A man moved forward from the crowd, and to my dismay, I saw it was my father. My mild-mannered, soft-spoken father who rarely raised his voice in the house. "Behave yourself, Tinker," he said in an authoritative tone. "If you touch that lad again, I'll have the law on you. You'll find yourself in the cells before you can draw breath." He knelt down beside Tom, who had doubled over and was vomiting on the grass. "Are you all right, lad?" With a great roar of rage, Tinker sprang at him, catching father a blow in the back with his boot. For a moment he went sprawling and I screamed. Mary grabbed my hand and we clung to each other as my father recovered and threw himself at the Tinker. In another moment they were at it, hammer and tongs, slugging it out like a pair of bare-knuckle fighters. "Sam Pearce was a rare one for a fist fight before he married that sourpuss," I heard a man's voice say, and a second agreed with a laugh. I glanced round, but could not see who had spoken. Every man present was calling out encouragement to my da, yelling their heads off in a fever of excitement as the fight went on and on. "Go on, Sam!" they roared. "Teach the bastard a lesson he'll not forget in a hurry." To my amazement, my father seemed to be doing just that. I let go of Mary's hand and started to scream encouragement at him. "Go on, Da! Give him one! Give him a bloody nose!" The fight ended as abruptly as it had begun as my father's fist connected with the Tinker's chin, laying him out cold. He lay twitching and moaning, but unable to get up again. Then Tom and one of his brothers were hauling their father to his feet, wrapping his arms round their necks and dragging him away. Only when they had moved off did I become aware of the unnatural silence. Everyone had stopped shouting, and there was an expectant hush. As I looked towards my father, now panting and wiping a smear of blood from his mouth, I saw the reason for the hush that had fallen over the crowd. My mother was standing alone, staring at my father as if she had seen a ghost. The look on her face was so strange and shocking that I left Mary's side and went to join her. She did not even glance at me, nor at Bob as he came to slip his hand into mine and look up at me anxiously. Her eyes were fixed on my father's face. He walked towards us, then reached out and took her hand. "We'll go home now, Rose," he said, and she went without a word. She had plenty to say when she had recovered from the shock, however. Bob and I got off lightly compared to the tongue-lashing she gave Dar after we had been sent supperless to bed. It wasn't possible to hear the words, but her voice was shrill and accusing downstairs, and I covered my ears with my hands, wishing it would stop. It wasn't a row. It couldn't be a row because my father never raised his voice to her. I could hear him answering her in a slow, soft tone that did not vary, and it made the memory of his fighting on the village green all the more impossible to believe. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I should never have given it credence. It was 10 minutes or so before Bob came and asked if he could get into bed with me. I pulled back the covers and let him. He snuggled against me as he had when he was a toddler, and I cuddled up to him, sensing his need for comfort.
Dar really gave it to him, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
Do you reckon Ma will ever forgive him?
I expect so, when she gets over it.
It wasn't his fault. He couldn't let Tom get kicked again, and no one else did anything.
She ought to be proud of him. I was proud of my Dar, proud of the way he had stood up for what was right, and of the way he had put the tinker down. I thought about what the men behind me had said, about my Dar being a rare one for a fist fight before he was married, and it made me wonder again just why he had married my mother. She must have been pretty enough when she was young, but there was no joy in her. Had she always been that way? I was downstairs before my father left for work the next day. He was looking at the previous night's paper, an article about the Prime Minister, Mr. Ramsay MacDonald, who was thinking of retiring. Dar looked up a bit sheepishly, and I told him I was proud of him. He shook his head and looked grave.
"It was a damn fool thing to do, Nellie," he said. "I'm old enough to know better."
"But you stood up to him, Dar. You were the only one brave enough to do it."
"The only one daft enough, according to your ma."
There was a rueful smile in his eyes as he touched his ribs.
"And this morning, I think she's right."
"It's time you were getting ready for school, Nellie." Mother had come into the room without us realising it. She glared at me, and I knew she had heard us talking. She always seemed angry if my father paid me any attention. "Can I set the table for you, Ma?" "If you want," she said grudgingly. "What do you fancy this morning, Sam?"
"The same as the rest of you," he said. "I think I'll just walk out to the allotment while the tea's brewing. Fancy a breath of air, Nellie?"
"I'd best do the table for Ma," I said, and watched him leave with regret. She turned on me the moment the door closed behind him, her eyes stabbing at me angrily. "You were dancing with one of those tinker trash when I arrived," she said, and as I stared at her in silence, she slapped me across the face. "If I ever catch you with one of them again, I'll get your father to take his belt to you. I've warned Bob, and now I'm warning you. You're to have nothing to do with that family, any of them. Do you understand me?" I pressed my hand to my burning flesh, feeling the sting of tears. "It was just a dance, Ma, and he didn't ask, he just grabbed me. Do you understand me?"
"Yes, Ma,"
I whispered, and blinked back my tears, determined not to cry in front of her. "Just remember what I've told you." She went out into the back kitchen, and I heard her banging the enamel pots on the gas stove. I spread a white cloth on the table and began to lay it with 4 places. Grandad never came down to breakfast these days. It took him too long to get out of bed in the mornings. It had been fun at the party. It had been fun dancing with Tom, even though I had been annoyed with him for just grabbing me like that. In its own way, even the fight had been fun once I'd seen my Dar was getting the better of the tinker. But my mother's sudden arrival had spoilt everything. I was angry with her until I remembered the look in her eyes as she stood staring at Dar. She had looked frightened, lost, lonely, and that had upset me. She had slapped me before. It wasn't the end of the world. She was still my mother, and I loved her even if she didn't seem to care for me that much. "I've done scrambled eggs the way you like them," she said, making me jump as she came into the room behind me. "Fetch your father in, Nellie, while I call that lazy young scamp down." "Yes, Ma." I ran off joyfully to fetch my father into his breakfast. My mother's words had been as near to an apology as I was ever likely to get from her. You can't always judge a book by its cover, Grandad said to me that afternoon when I brought him a cup of tea and sat with my knees hunched up on the stool at his feet. Some folk might think Sam Pearce weak because he lets your mother rule the roost, but slow-flowing rivers often run deep, lass. It's not the first time your father has thrashed a man, and it doesn't surprise me.
He's never seemed like one for a fight before.
Maybe he's never had reason that you know of.
Grandad took out his heavy gold watch and opened the cover to look at the white enamel dial.
Will you pop down to the shop for me before they close, Nellie?
You know I will, I said and sprang to my feet. What can I get for you?
An ounce of baccy and one of those walnut cakes you like. We'll have it for tea.
My mother would say it was a waste of money buying cakes from the baker's shop, but sometimes Grandad liked to give us all a treat, and what she didn't know wouldn't hurt her. I took the money, kissed him, and ran before she could come in from the scullery and ask where I was going. The warm weather was changing, and there was a cool breeze as I set off down the street. I walked quickly because it was chilly and I wanted to get back home as soon as I could. It was only as I got to the corner that I saw Tom Herries come out of my father's shop. He waved and called to me to wait. I hesitated because of my mother's warning, but then realised I couldn't ignore him. He ran across the road to join me. His face was covered with bruises ranging from yellow to a dark purple, far more of them than he had had the previous afternoon.
What happened to your face?
It was Tinker, he said. He thrashed me, but it was for the last time. I'm never going back to the van. I've only stayed this long for my mother's sake, but I won't stay now. She should have left him years ago. If she hasn't the sense to get out, it's her own fault. One of these days he'll kill her, if I don't kill him first.
His words sent a coldness down my spine.
You don't mean that.
I'll kill him if I stay. That's why I'm leaving. I just wanted to say goodbye and to tell you I was sorry.
Sorry? For what?
For what happened yesterday, your Dar getting into that fight with mine.
Dar couldn't see you get hurt. It wasn't your fault.
Tinker isn't so bad when he's sober, Tom said. When he was younger, he was halfway decent. It's the drink that's dragged him down. A man's a fool to drink, especially if he can't hold it.
I think my Dar had had a couple of drinks too.
That's different, he can take it. Tinker can't. He gets nasty when he's drunk. He's an evil devil then, I can tell you. He's thrashed every one of us in his time, but he won't touch me again.
Where will you go, Tom?
Here and there. I'll find myself a job somewhere in the Dales. Father's going south and I hope he stays there for good.
Well, goodbye then, Tom.
See you around, he said, and went off whistling.
I stared after him for a moment, then set off at a run for the corner shop. It was just as well Tom and his family were going. Ma would skin me alive if she knew I had been talking to him. We couldn't be friends, and I wasn't much of a liar.
Your last day at school,
Mary Hopkins said as we left the playground together. The summer had arrived, and it was warm that day.
Aren't you the lucky one then? I've got another whole term to go just because I was born a few weeks later than you.
It was 7 weeks after the street party and my 15th birthday. That morning I had received cards from my parents, Bob, and a special one with 5 shillings in from my grandad. Mother had given me some lisle and wool stockings and a sensible nightdress, and from Mary I had received a bottle of Evening in Paris scent. My schoolteacher had given me a novel, one of the new Penguin paperbacks that could be sold cheaply. My teacher said it would enable the ordinary woman to buy more books for themselves, but even a shilling was a fortune to me. Mary had been moaning for days about the fact that I was leaving school before her. I was torn 2 ways. A part of me wanted to stay in the safe, familiar world of childhood, but it was exciting to be on the threshold of a whole new world. Not that I expected my life to change very much. Nothing had been said about my finding a job, and I thought my mother wanted me to stay at home and help in the house, as many girls still did, even though there were more opportunities for jobs these days. I had thought about going into a factory or a shop, but there was plenty of time to make up my mind during the long school holidays. "It will be your turn next," I replied. I lingered, somehow unwilling to part from my friend. "I'm going to miss you, Mary."
"We'll see each other at weekends."
It won't be the same, though.
You're not regretting being through with school?
I hesitated, thinking of something our headmistress had said to me during break that morning. She'd stopped me on my way back to class after I'd seen some of the younger children in from the playground.
I'd like a word, Nellie.
Yes, Miss Brown. I'd stared at her with a fast-beating heart, wondering what I'd done to attract her notice, but she smiled at me for once, her stern features softening.
So you're leaving us today, Nellie?
Yes, Miss Brown.
That's a pity. You're an intelligent girl. I'd hoped you might stay on, take further education and make something of yourself. You have a way with the younger children.
She pursed her thin lips.
Haven't you ever considered becoming a teacher?
No, miss.
It was true that I liked looking after the young ones, but didn't all girls feel that way? It was surely just a part of preparing for womanhood and a family.
My mother has always said I should leave when I was 15,
I said as Miss Brown frowned.
It might have been nice, though.
Perhaps there was a wistful note in my voice, for she hesitated and said, Well, if ever you want help with furthering your education, come and see me.
Yes, miss. Thank you. I shall.
It had given me a warm feeling to know that she thought me intelligent. I'd done well enough, coming near to the top of the class in several subjects, but I was used to Mother's treatment of me as if I were an idiot at home, and had never thought of myself as bright, certainly not clever enough to be a teacher. Now as I looked at Mary, I felt uneasy, though I didn't know why. Perhaps it was the odd looks Mother had been giving me recently.
No, I suppose I won't miss school, I said. See you on Saturday, then.
My feet dragged all the way home. There was no reason for the peculiar sensation of dread at the pit of my stomach, but it had been there all day, nagging at me, making me nervous. When I saw the large black car parked outside my home, the sickness churned inside me, rising to a lump in my throat. So few people had cars round here. Don't let it be the doctor. Don't let Grandad be ill. I flew down the covered passage to the back door, my heart racing. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to Grandad. I couldn't. He had seemed a bit quiet these last couple of days, but I hadn't realised he was ill. I threw back the door wide open and went rushing in, then stopped and stared at the two women sitting in the kitchen. One was older than my mother, with a plain, straight look about her. The other, several years younger, well-dressed and attractive, but somehow dowdy despite the quality of her clothes. Neither of them was known to me, but their eyes were bright with curiosity as they looked at me. For a while there was silence while I tried to gather my wits. Then one of them, the eldest, spoke. "So, this is Nellie," she said, and gave a decisive nod. "She looks strong and healthy. Very well, Mrs. Pearce, we'll take her." She got to her feet and began to pull on a pair of grey cotton gloves. "No need to stop for anything, Nellie. Your mother has packed your things." "Packed my things?" I was stunned, disbelieving as I looked at my mother. "Ma, what does she mean?" "Mind your manners, girl." Mother looked through me, her eyes refusing to meet mine. "Whatever will these good ladies think of you?" "This is Miss Alice Harrington." She indicated the younger woman, who smiled at me. "And this is Mrs. Jermyn's. She's housekeeper at Beaumont House out Malham way. She has come to fetch you. You're to work for her, for the family now." Work for her? There was a tightness in my chest. I still couldn't believe this was happening. "You mean I'm to go into service? This is what you're saying, isn't it?" "Yes." Mother's mouth was thin and white-edged. "It has all been arranged. Don't make a fuss, Nellie. You're to go with Mrs. Jermyn's now." I was stunned. I hadn't given much consideration to my future, but the last thing I would ever have thought of doing was entering domestic service. "But you never said!" The words burst out of me. "What about Da and Grandad? When shall I see them?" "You'll come home when you have a day off," Mother said, so cold and ungiving. "Do as you're told, Nellie. It's a good place. You should be grateful to your father for arranging it." Da had arranged it himself. I recoiled as if I had been struck and the fight drained out of me. If my father had agreed to my being sent away like this, it was useless to appeal. It was my birthday.
and I was being sent off without even being allowed to have my tea. The callous cruelty of it was numbing. "Don't be too harsh with her," the younger woman spoke for the first time, her voice soft and appealing. "It's all right, Nellie. I'm sure you will be happy with us, and you'll be able to come home every month. There's always someone coming this way to give you a lift." She was trying to be kind, but I was too shocked to appreciate it. All I knew was that my safe, happy world had suddenly fallen apart. "Of course Nellie will be happy with us. If she behaves properly and works hard. You really must leave this to me, Miss Alice, if you please." Mrs. Jermyn spoke appeasingly to her companion, but there was a hint of annoyance in her voice, as if she resented the interference. I looked at her properly for the first time and swallowed hard. She had iron grey hair scraped back into a bun beneath her plain black felt hat, and her lips were thin and pale. She seemed formidable, and I thought she might be as sharp-tongued as my mother. A wave of rebellion swept over me. I wanted to scream and shout, but held the misery inside me. It wasn't fair. I hadn't even been told what was going on. For one moment my eyes met the hard, unforgiving stab of my mother's icy gaze. Then I turned away. Why did she hate me so much? What had I ever done to deserve this from my own mother?
Chapter 2. Cheer up, Nellie. Going into service ain't the end of the world. It's hard work, but you'll get used to it, and it has its perks now and then.
I stared at the girl with whom I was to share a bed for the foreseeable future, curiosity beginning to overcome the feeling of misery which had stayed with me during the journey to Beaumont House. We were in an attic room that was even smaller than my own bedroom at home. It was barely big enough to hold the brass and iron bed, scratched single wardrobe and marble-topped washstand, and I had to share it with Iris.
"Like what?" I asked. "What kind of perks?" "Miss Alice gives us things when she feels like it, and Cook ain't stingy with our food. We eat as well as them upstairs." I had already been given my tea in the kitchen, which was about 3 times the size of ours at home. The walls were painted a dark cream and lined with pine dresses on 3 sides, the 4th almost entirely taken up by the black iron cooking range. There were lots of copper pans everywhere, and the room smelled deliciously of spices and baking. The meal itself had consisted of bread and butter, homemade jams, and 3 kinds of cake, far more than I was used to at home. Much of the fruit and produce must have come from the walled garden I'd glimpsed when we arrived. Like many of the big houses, they would provide their own vegetables for the table.
"Leave even a crumb and you'll get less next time," Iris had whispered. "If you can't manage the cake, put it in your pocket for later."
Iris had devoured every scrap of her own food with a hungry concentration that made me think she must be half-starved. She was a tall, thin girl with a pale complexion and straight, dark hair she wore scraped back beneath a white cap, but she was talkative and friendly, and her careless chatter had begun to ease the ache inside me.
"Miss Alice came with Mrs. Jermyn's to fetch me,"
I said as I began to unpack my things from the battered trunk Mother had sent over by carrier.
"She drove the car herself."
Iris nodded, lowering her voice confidentially.
"Driving herself didn't go down too well at first with them upstairs. Sir Charles and Lady Amelia, that is. Not ladylike, you see. Leastways, that's what Her Highness says."
"You mean Lady Amelia?"
I smiled inwardly as I heard the note of disrespect in her voice.
"Don't you like her?"
"Not much."
Iris pulled a face.
"Never a smile or so much as a thank you from her, no matter what you do, not even if you've sat up half the night waiting for her to come home, and that ain't right, even if she was the one brought the money to the family. Inherited money, that's what keeps this family going. Now, Miss Alice is different. She's what I call a real lady, and she's got guts. She's stuck to her guns, even though they tried to bully her into giving up her lessons. Says she needs to drive for her charity work. Does a lot of that since..."
Iris coloured and looked self-conscious, as if she had said too much.
"Since what? Go on, tell me. You can't stop now."
"You won't say as I told you?"
"No, of course not. Cross my heart and hope to die."
Iris giggled as I made the sign of the cross dramatically across my breast.
"I'm not sure if that counts if you ain't a Catholic. You ain't, are you?"
No, go on, Iris. Tell me about Miss Alice.
Blighted in love she were, poor woman.
Iris drew a sighing breath.
He were ever so handsome, so I've heard, but not good enough for her highness upstairs. Some sort of scandal in his family. So he was sent packing, and Miss Alice broke her heart over him and vowed she would devote herself to good works and never marry.
That's sad. How old is she?
33 if she's a day.
Iris replied and pulled her face.
She's an old maid and sure to die one now. Shame, ain't it?
When did this happen?
Must be more than 10 years now. I heard as he went off abroad to make his fortune.
Maybe he'll come back and marry her one day.
Not if that old sourpuss upstairs has her way.
Is Miss Alice Lady Amelia's daughter?
Iris shook her head. She's Sir Charles's youngest sister. He had another one, but she died 5 years ago, of scarlet fever, poor thing. Near broke Miss Alice's heart again, that did.
Do they have any children, them upstairs?
Don't let Mrs. Germans hear you call them that.
Iris looked guilty.
I'm getting you into bad ways, and you not here even a couple of hours.
Mrs. Germans was in charge of the maidservants, and seeing everything was run properly. I know better than to make that mistake. I hung a dark blue wool dress in the wardrobe next to the two that already hung there, and were seemingly all Iris possessed besides her uniforms.
That's a nice dress, she remarked, a wistful note in her voice. Your Sunday best?
She stroked the soft material as I nodded.
Pity you won't be able to wear it, except on your days off.
Not even on Sunday?
You mean we have to wear these horrible things all the time? The uniforms aren't so bad, Iris said. Better than what I had before I came here anyway. My mother was left a widow with 8 kids to feed and clothe. I never had a dress like yours, not once.
I'm sorry, I said, and felt guilty. I didn't know. I didn't realise.
It's all right. I've got dresses of my own now. Miss Alice gave me that brown one there. It fits me a treat.
It's very nice, I said, though I thought the colour a bit dull for Iris's complexion. I could hear a wireless playing. It sounded like Nelson Eddy yodelling and must be rather loud for it to reach all the way up here. I was trying to listen and not paying much attention when Iris suddenly said,
They've got one son, Mr. Lucas.
There was such a peculiar note in her voice then that I turned to look at her. What's wrong with Mr. Lucas?
Is he like his mother?
Her cheeks stained with fiery colour.
No, he's just a bit odd, that's all.
What do you mean?
Iris was obviously determined to say no more on the subject. You'll find out for yourself, she muttered. If you've finished, we'd better go down to the kitchen and see what needs doing. They'll have had dinner upstairs by now. I'd have been helping serve it, only it's my night off, but I gave it up to see you settled in.
That was kind of you. I'm glad you're here, Iris. It won't seem so bad now that I've met you.
You'll be all right, Iris said. I expect you'll be helping in the kitchens for a start. Cook's a decent soul. Providing you don't upset her, she can be a right tartar if she likes, but that ain't often. I'm the parlour maid.
A look of pride came into Iris's face. But now and then I help Miss Alice dress when she goes out. She won't have a maid of her own, and she don't like Mabel. That's her Highness's personal dresser. So I help out just now and then. She don't go out socially that often, says it's a waste of time. Iris looked wistful. That's what I'd like to be one day, a lady's maid. Or maybe I'll work in a posh dress shop.
Don't you want to marry and have a family?
No thanks, Iris exclaimed. You wouldn't catch me living the way my ma does. Never enough money to go round, working day and night to make ends meet, and a house full of screaming kids to take care of when she comes back after wearing herself out scrubbing and washing for others. I suppose it must be hard if you have to go out charring and then take care of a family as well. But surely it doesn't have to be like that. Your ma was unlucky. If your father hadn't died... Iris gave a snort of derision.
That's all you know. The day he kicked the bucket was a lucky day. The lazy beggar spent all his time drinking when he had money and taking it out on her when he didn't. She was well rid of him.
But all men aren't like that. I thought of my silent grandfather keeping his thoughts to himself to avoid causing trouble in the house, and my soft-spoken father giving in to my mother more often than not. I'd only heard him raise his voice to her twice, and that was when she'd been on at me or Bob. Tears sprang to my eyes as I realised I would not see either Dar or Grandad very often in future, but I brushed them away. Iris gave me a look of understanding.
Thinking about your family?
She asked softly, and slipped an arm about my waist, giving me a quick squeeze.
It won't be so bad here, honest.
Thanks. I cleared my throat. I don't suppose it will. Be interesting anyway. I might even like it. When Iris and I went downstairs that first evening, we found the kitchen a hive of frantic activity. There had been a delay with dinner, some kind of ructions upstairs apparently, and Cook was muttering darkly about giving her notice if this went on. She was a big woman with a double chin, sharp, intelligent eyes which mostly held a twinkle, except when she was upset, as now, and thick, short fingers that were surprisingly dexterous when rolling pastry or shaping mountains of delicious food.
"I'll not stand for my dinner being ruined,"
she said, and shook her chins at the butler, a tall, thin man with a long nose and an air of hauteur.
"I'm warning you, Mr. Sands. If there's much more of this, I shall leave. My sister in Bournemouth has been after me to go into a hotel with her, and I'll do it. I vow I will."
Now, Mrs. Jones," he soothed, obviously used to her and not in the least ruffled by her threats.
"No real harm's been done. Besides, it's only the family tonight, and if the beef is a little overdone, it's their own fault." "Indeed it is," she muttered. "But it's my reputation at stake here, Mr. Sands. My reputation." "Not in the least," he reassured her. "Everyone knows it isn't your fault." "You girl," Cook's eyes suddenly lighted on me. "Strain that broccoli for me and be quick about it. Put it in the large tureen."
"Yes, Mrs. Jones. That one warming by the range?"
"Yes, and don't break it. I want every drop of water out, mind. One thing I won't put up with is water in my vegetables."
"Nor will my da," I replied without thinking. "He can't abide soggy greens."
"My broccoli is never soggy." Cook glared at me. "I hope you weren't implying it."
"No, Ma'am. I can see it's just right, just as it should be." In the middle of the careful operation of straining the broccoli, I was unaware of the sudden hush until I turned to find Cook's baleful eyes on me.
"And what would you know about it, miss?"
Iris was pulling frantic faces at me. I swallowed hard, not wanting to make an enemy of the woman who ruled supreme in the kitchens. "Nothing very much," I mumbled, "but I like cooking and broccoli should be crisp, just like this. Some people make it soggy, but then it's awful." For one dreadful moment I thought Cook was angry, but then I caught a twinkle in her eyes and guessed she was testing me.
"Most new girls don't even know what broccoli is," she observed. "You've been brought up right, girl. Like cooking, do you?"
"Yes, Mum. I know about broccoli because Grandad used to grow it, but Da's not very successful. Hasn't got the same touch."
"Let me look at that tureen."
Cook lifted the lid as I placed it on the table before her. Her eyes narrowed as she looked suspiciously for any sign of water. Then she wiped the narrow rim with her cloth and replaced the fitted lid.
"Always use a clean cloth to wipe the rim," she instructed. "Not bad, though, not bad. So, you like cooking, then?"
She turned back to me as Mr. Sands and one of the other maids, whom I had not yet met, carried away trays of steaming hot food in silver dishes.
"Well, tell me your name, then."
"It's Nellie, Ma'am."
"Mrs. Jones will do,"
Cook said, a definite sparkle in her eyes now.
"It's Ma'am for her ladyship, remember that. If you see her and she stops you, which isn't likely unless you're doing something you shouldn't."
"I'll try not to do something I shouldn't."
"So I should hope."
Cook's tone was still sharp, but her mood had obviously mellowed.
"There's a pile of washing up in the scullery for you to make a start on," she said. "Iris will show you where before she goes off."
I followed her into the back kitchen where mounds of dirty dishes had already been stacked in deep stone sinks. "Make sure you rinse the glasses in cold water," Iris warned, "and wash everything well. You'll be in for it if Mrs. Jones finds grease on her dishes." "She won't," I promised. "I like her." "She's not a bad sort," Iris agreed. "I think she liked you, and that's a good start." She hesitated for a moment. "I'd give you a hand, but there's choir practice at the church this evening, and I'm already late." "You get off," I said. "It was good of you to stay for my sake, Iris, but I can manage now." "I shan't be long," she replied with a smile. "We'll talk later." Turning back to the sink, I plunged my hands into the hot water and began to wash the fine china plates that had been left to soak. It wasn't the way I'd expected to spend my first evening after leaving school, but it wasn't so bad. I was busy all weekend washing dishes, helping Mrs. Jones by preparing the vegetables, sweeping the back stairs and scrubbing the kitchen floor, and getting to know the other servants. Besides Iris, Mrs. Jones and Mr. Sands, there was Henry Brooks, who waited at table and doubled as Sir Charles's valet, the under-parlour maid Janet, a shy girl who had little to say for herself and was in awe of Iris, another maid who helped in the kitchens and was called Doris, and a woman who came in to do most of the rough jobs. There was also 3 gardeners who did all the outside work, including chopping kindling for the kitchen. They were always in trouble with Mrs. Jones for bringing mud in on their boots. Of Mabel, or Miss Parkinson, as she was officially known to everyone below stairs, I caught only a fleeting glimpse that weekend. Miss Parkinson, as her ladyship's personal dresser, ate with Mrs. Jermyn's and seldom showed herself in the servants' hall. Iris said she thought she was above the rest of us and gave herself airs. Both Saturday and Sunday passed peacefully enough, and it was not until I came downstairs on Monday morning that I had a rude awakening. Instead of remaining in the kitchen to help cook, I was told to join Doris in the laundry room. The laundry room? I hadn't given a thought to the masses of washing that must accumulate in a household this size. You mean I've got to help in the laundry too?
You and me both,
Doris said and shrugged.
Mrs. Briggs comes in on Mondays to give us a hand, but Tuesday to Friday it's just you and me in the mornings.
You and me? We have to wash clothes every day, I groaned. Every day of the week. My heart sank as I finally understood what kind of a job my parents had landed me with. Ma wouldn't care, but I thought Dar would have refused to send me here if he'd known how much I would hate it.
There's a lot of washing in a house like this, Doris said. Sir Charles changes his shirt at least twice a day, sometimes more, and the sheets are done 3 times a week. Ours are done just once top to bottom, same as at home, but they like fresh sheets top and bottom.
It's a pity they don't have to wash them.
You're a lark, you are,
Doris said, screwing up her snub nose.
What do you think you're here for?
I didn't know it was to help out in the laundry room.
Did you think you was going straight into the parlour then?
Doris derided.
I've been here 18 months and I've never been upstairs yet.